yesterday upstairs at the Lighthouse, and I'm sure many of you went out for dinner and saw the beautiful city. So I also hope you've had enough coffee this morning. We're going to kick off with a fantastic session. Before we do, I just want to remind you that if you'd like to tweet, put across social media, please do. The hashtag is #GenSummit. Please do take a look at Twitter and see what's going on. There's a lot of questions being asked. I'm also going to check Twitter at the end, so if you've got any burning questions for Nick and Rasmus, please do pop them in via Twitter as well, and we'll check that. So we have the much anticipated Reuters Institute Digital News Report 2019, which is going to be presented by Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, who is the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Quite often in bios, you'll have a list of achievements, and Rasmus has got a long list of books that he has already published, which is incredible. He is very well versed on the state of journalism and how digital is changing that, so we're really looking forward to hearing from him. And Nick Newman, of course, who's a senior research associate at Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, who many of you will have heard from before. So two excellent presenters. Now, the report has been slightly delayed, the printed report. It was held up in customs because it's clearly very dangerous for the news industry. But that will be available later on the Gen stands. We'll try and get it up there by lunchtime, but do make sure that you pop by this afternoon and you'll get a printed report. We'll also have the digital report available. I believe that Nick's going to be putting it up later, but again, we'll put it on Twitter and make sure you get access to that. So Rasmus, Nick, please do come out and tell us all about the state of news.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and to Jen and Bertrand for having us here today. Journalism exists in the context of its audience. The public importance of what we do, the political significance of it, and the financial sustainability of what we do is all premised in the connection that we have with the people who use the news that we produce, who enjoy it, who find it valuable. And if we want to fight for a safe and robust and prosperous future for journalism, we have to understand how the ways in which people engage with news and media is changing. And that's really what we try to do in the annual digital news report with Nick and the team leading on our research, to provide independent, evidence-based international research on the ways in which people around the world are using news and media, how that's changing, and how they're thinking about it, so it can inform the work that people like you do of stewarding your organizations through this period of change and the challenges and opportunities that come with that. So this is the 8th annual digital news report, and we are delighted to launch again here at Jen, as we've done in the past. We will highlight just a few key findings from this, and I want to stress that the full report and the underlying data is available on the digital news report website, so do check out the website for more in-depth analysis of issues or countries and opportunities to explore the data in greater depth for your own purposes. We're also posting the slides on the Jen hashtag and the hashtag DNR19 that we have used for discussions around the report, so there'll be more content available there for those who are interested in that. About the report itself, as many of you know, this is the biggest ongoing survey of news across the world. More than 75,000 respondents in 38 markets this year, 6 continents. We're very happy to have been able to add South Africa to the report this year as a further demonstration of our commitment to studying news worldwide with the support of the Open Society Foundations. I should also say, as we do every year, that this is an online survey. So we look at online news users, and we do examine their cross-media habits, but it will slightly underrepresent the habits of older people, less affluent people, and obviously people who do not have access to the internet, which does influence the overall picture in countries with limited internet penetration, but in those with 80 or 90%, it's broadly indicative of the public as whole. The polling was done by YouGov on our behalf. We used samples of about 2,000 respondents in almost every market. And this is all made possible by the coalition of funders, of course, from our point of view, particularly importantly, our core funder, the Thomson Reuters Foundation that supports the Reuters Institute, but also the 15 different funders that support the Digital News Report project specifically, including media organizations like the BBC, technology companies like Google, media regulators like Ofcom and others, foundations, industry associations, and a number of universities from around the world. So just a few key headlines from this year's report. We find first that more people are paying for online news, but mainly in a few countries and primarily for a few big brands. Secondly, we find that as concerns over misinformation flourish, people say they are relying on more reputable brands than this time last year. Some opportunities there for publishers, some publishers. Third, trust in news overall continues to fall, so not everyone will benefit from this, with complaints about overload, about negativity, and other ways in which people do not always feel that journalism in fact serves their interests as well as we would hope. We see change in the way in which platforms are used, with less time spent on Facebook and more time spent with Instagram, YouTube, and WhatsApp. And finally, podcasts seem to be striking a real chord with consumers, especially with younger people. So I will run through a few sections of the findings here, and then I'll hand it over to Nick Newman, the lead author, who is the real force behind the report, as most of you are aware of. We'll have a few minutes for discussion, and then the session later today where people can grill us over issues of interest. So, paying for news first. Let's start with the money. So the search for sustainable business models really goes on. It's clear that the digital advertising market is incredibly competitive, and the dominant role of platform companies is making life quite difficult for advertising-supported publishers. And with that, more publishers are pinning their hopes on reader payments for various kinds of subscriptions. Overall, we see the number of people paying in any way for any kind of news online. In the US, 16% say that they are paying. But in other countries like the UK, the number is much lower, just 9% saying they're paying. And then there are regions in the world like the Nordic countries where 23% by now say that they are paying in some form for some form of digital news, with Norway in particular leading the pack. Now, how this plays out at the individual publisher level is not something we can document on the basis of our survey data alone, but I think it's indicative to look at data from FIP, for example, which has collected the number of subscribers reported by some major organizations in the US, which I think indicates how a large number of subscriptions are going to a few upmarket titles with national and potentially international appeal. It's also clear from our survey data, looking at the people who say that they are paying for news, that most publishers who are competing for the pay market are competing for the same group of a relatively small number of people who are highly educated, who are more affluent, and who are very interested in news. So it's a relatively small minority of the population that most of these premium publishers building pay models are competing for. Now, a complication here, of course, is that how much is people going to be willing to pay for? So when we break down our data on the number of things that people subscribe for, just looking specifically at ongoing payments for news, by far the largest numbers of people who pay only for one subscription. So this is the average across the 38 markets, where about 60% of those who say they pay for news pay for one subscription, and only about 40% pay for more than one. So the question here is whether this is sort of a winner-takes-most market situation, where just a few titles will be able to corner the market for subscriptions, and most people may find that they'll struggle to get into that bundle of things that people are paying for. That's, of course, further complicated by the fact that we've moved a long way away from the idea of a sort of a culture of free on the internet, and that people are paying for more and more things that they value and enjoy in the digital media environment. And in that way, publishers benefit from the fact that we're no longer fully accustomed to everything being free online. But of course, there's also a competitive dimension to this, in that they are competing with many other things that people pay for. Not only news, but also premium video streaming, music streaming, sport, online gambling, storage, online dating, and other services that are increasingly based on subscription models. So to get a sense of where news fits into this sort of portfolio of subscriptions from the point of view of the user, we've asked people sort of quite a provocative question, if you will, which is if you could choose to keep only one of the subscriptions that you currently have, which one would it be? And then we break it down by age. So for those over 45, news clocks in at 15%, so significantly behind Netflix and the like, but still a not insignificant number say that news is the one subscription they would keep if forced to choose. But for those under 45, it is just 7%, and it's clear that streaming services like Netflix and Spotify at this stage seems to be a far more compelling value proposition from the point of view of many younger media users in the world. So with high-priced single-title subscriptions being hard to grow, it's clear that all but the strongest branch will struggle in this environment. And the question here, I suppose, is whether there are ways of moving forward based on differential pricing, on various forms of bundling, student offers, and other ways of persuading wider groups to pay. It's also clear that as publishers experiment with these things, which we think are very important to pursue aggressively as advertising revenues are hard to come by, that it introduces some friction in the experience for many users. So, for example, in Norway, by now 70% of our respondents say that they have come across one or more paywalls in the last week while reading news, and in the US, the figure for that is 15%. Now, it's clear consumers don't always value or appreciate these bumps on the road to news. These are quotes from some of the qualitative research we've done where, here is a user who argued that publishers should flag up paid-up content before they make me click on links to that content, and another who expressed, if you will, the desire for free at the point of consumption access to news. Don't we all like quality things that are available for free? Now, the question of friction, of course, is tied into the question of gateways and the ways in which people discover news in an increasingly digital media environment. We've been tracking this for some time, and I think it's worth sort of re-upping the big picture here before diving into some of the new findings from this year's iteration of the report. The first and absolutely sort of key top-line point here, of course, is that the overall ways in which people discover news online is fundamentally different from what we are used to from a pre-digital environment, in that when we ask people about their main way of accessing news online across 38 markets, only 29% say that going direct to the website or app of a news publisher is their main way of accessing news online. And 71% of our respondents identify some form of site door access, whether those are the big forms of distributed discovery like search and social, in some countries increasingly aggregators, or they are forms of site door access that are to a larger extent driven by publishers themselves but still separate from the website or app, things like mobile alerts on the lock screen and email newsletters, which are again important for a growing number of publishers. Now, overall, this picture is important in every country. Every news user is increasingly relying on search and social and other forms of platform products and services to find and access news. But specifically on the question of what is the most important or main way of accessing news, we find some very pronounced country differences that we just want to sort of break out for people to consider. We have different models of online access. We have countries like Finland where even today, with the platforms being as popular and powerful as they are and widely used, 64% in Finland say that they still primarily go direct to websites and apps of news providers for their online news. In contrast, we have markets like Chile, Brazil, and Malaysia, where social is the most widely named main way of accessing news online, and in the case of Chile, more than 40%. Then there are markets like the US, where the picture is very mixed, and different parts of the population rely on different ways of finding news. News lovers go direct. People with less interest in news often rely on search and social. So a more sort of a mixed picture, if you will. And then finally, markets often in parts of Asia that are deeply aggregated, like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, where search is important, but also aggregators are far more important than they are in many countries in Western Europe and North America. Now, this, of course, is in part about the discovery of news and the journey that users are on. It's in part about who captures attention, and as a consequence of that, also advertising. But it's also linked to the question of how we can convince users to pay for news. We wanted to look at the ways in which discovery is interlinked with subscription. And our data suggests that the link is quite pronounced, that the publishers that are more capable of building a direct relationship with their audience are more capable also of convincing them to subscribe. So search and social, great for widening the funnel. But when we look at the correlation between, at the market level, between the proportion who say that they pay for digital-only subscriptions and then the proportion who say that they prefer direct access, we see that the companies, the countries that have the highest levels of direct access, countries like Finland, Sweden, and Norway, are also the countries where we have the highest numbers of people paying for online news. Another part of the development of the platform's role in the media environment is the move to private messaging and various forms of private groups. And I want to dwell on this just a minute, because this is also, I think, a relatively new development in some countries in the world, even though we know that in many parts of the global south, this has been the state of play for a couple of years. In part, this is about a change in the way in which people use different social media. So we see no decline in the overall percentage of people who say they use Facebook for any purpose, 64% across 38 markets. No change really in Twitter either, but quite a significant growth in WhatsApp, in Facebook Messenger, in Instagram, and also to a smaller extent, Snapchat. Now, the question then is, how do people use this for news? And there we see a real decline in the percentage of people who say that they get news via Facebook. And this in part, of course, is driven by algorithm changes from Facebook itself. On the contrast, WhatsApp and Instagram, for example, are on the rise. And by now, across 38 markets, we see more people, far more people identifying WhatsApp as one of the ways in which they get news online than say that they get news via, for example, Twitter. This is tied in, I suppose, with the question of whether people find this is always time well spent. We asked people about how much time they've spent with different platform products and services in the last year. And there the pattern is one where Facebook see a clear drop, in particular amongst the younger people. Snapchat also, a big drop. And then a number of other platforms here, perhaps particularly importantly, YouTube, WhatsApp, and Instagram, are all registering people saying that they spend more time with these platforms. So they're becoming more important overall, but also more important for news use. WhatsApp in particular, I think we're seeing become incredibly important in many parts of the global south. These are just a couple. I'm mentioning India here, which we did a separate digital news report specifically on English language internet users in India. So this is not representative of the total Indian population or even the total Indian online population. But in markets like that, and Brazil and South Africa also stand out, by now we have about 50% of our respondents saying that they get news via WhatsApp. This is tied in with groups, of course, and sometimes these are groups where people are in groups with many other people, many of whom they do not know, and the risk here, of course, is that these become vehicles for the dissemination of various forms of disinformation. And we have other situations in many northern countries where WhatsApp may be used for other purposes, but for news, not so much. So just 4% of our respondents in the United States, for example, say that they get news via WhatsApp. So this is tied in with the move to groups, not only on WhatsApp, but also Facebook aggressively pushing groups as a part of the experience here. We have looked at our survey data and find that the people who say that they get news via groups on platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook tend to be overwhelmingly more likely to be male. They are, interestingly, more highly educated than the average person in our sample. They're also more politically partisan and more distrustful of mainstream media. So you can sort of see what kind of ecology is emerging in these groups around the world and what kind of tenure one should expect from discussions around news in that space. How important they are, it really varies by country. In countries like Turkey and Brazil, we have very high numbers of people saying that they use Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups for getting information about news and politics, whereas this is a much smaller minority in many Western countries, at least at this stage. So this is where I hand it over to Nick, who will take it from misinformation and onward. You get the fun part, Nick, please.
Thanks, Rasmus. So the nature of misinformation is changing. As Rasmus says, it's as likely to be spreading now through WhatsApp or Facebook groups as open networks like Facebook itself or Twitter. And the concern about whether people can tell the difference between what is real and fake on the internet when it comes to news, in a number of countries we see that actually growing over the last year. So across all the countries, it's around half of us, 55%, say we're extremely worried about this issue. But one of the really interesting things from this year's data is that this concern does seem to be changing behavior online in a way that may be benefiting some publishers. So across all the countries, more than a quarter say that they are now relying more on reputable sources than they were a year ago. and that's higher in some countries. We actually left it to respondents to define what they meant by reputable. But here is Chloe, one of the people we talked to, interviewed as part of the project, talking about brands with a track record like the BBC and the Guardian and how she's turning more to them, so limiting the number of sources. Related to that, we see other people saying they are relying less on what they consider to be less reputable brands. So 24% across all countries. And again, in the interviews, this came out as a really strong theme. So here's somebody talking about being much more careful when they're looking at the sourcing of things when they're in those distributed environments. It's worth pointing out both those interviews were with young people, and young people broadly are changing their behavior. Older people have not quite got the picture yet. Here's just some international comparisons. So again, on the issue of reputable sources, you can see the green there, much higher. So 40% of the US say that they're relying more on reputable sources than they were a year ago. Brazil the same. These are countries which have been more affected by disinformation compared with, say, the Netherlands and Germany, where concern is lower and the change is lower. And then we also asked about sharing behavior. And the numbers are really striking here. In Brazil, 61% of our samples said they decided not to share an unreliable story in social media in the last year. Again, much lower in countries that have been less affected by the issue, such as Germany and Netherlands. So this brings me on to the question of trust. And overall, the percentage saying that they trust most news most of the time has fallen by around 2% across countries. So in some countries it's stable, in some countries it's going down. But when we look at that by country, we see huge variations with Finland and Portugal there at the top, so around 60% say they trust most news most of the time, right down to countries like Greece, France and Korea, where maybe only 1 in 4 say they trust most news most of the time. We also see how political events and populist events can dramatically influence trust in particular countries. So Brazil, extremely fractious election, but also this year, the Gilets jaunes protest in France, which seems to have partly been behind an 11% fall in the trust scores in the news since last year. And when we dig into this much more deeply, we see the traditional media in particular coming under attack, sometimes verbally, but actually sometimes physically as well, from yellow vest protesters who accuse them variously of either not representing their views or not understanding their views or being too close to the government, being part of the elite essentially. So there's a real sort of issue of representation here. And in some countries, including France, we see partisan websites or state-backed media stepping into the vacuum, quite often using social media distribution. So Russia Today in France was a great example. So they went onto the protest, onto the barricades, and they filmed the protesters with Facebook Lives for a long period of time. So the actual numbers, relatively low in our data, only 3% use Russia Today France in the week that we polled, but much higher around with social media users, and Russia Today's coverage was amplified and had a really significant impact. And then you can see on the right there the brands that are driving that fall in trust. So looking at the scores of TV brands like BFM, for example, the 24-hour news channel, France Télévisions, losing trust partly because of the way in which they were perceived as not representing the protesters. And then one final example of the impact of populism and polarization can be seen in the trust figures for the US. So here you're really seeing the impact of the Trump election on media trust scores. So before Donald Trump was elected, you can see relatively similar levels of trust from the left and the right. But then from 2017, you saw this sort of massive increase. People on the left essentially saying we need to support the media like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and those trust scores going up to 51% amongst people on the left. But look what's happened to the trust scores on the right. And a lot of that, of course, is likely to have been fueled by the rhetoric from Donald Trump and others around you can't believe anything in the mainstream media. This year, we've tried to understand more the impact of populism. especially in Europe at a sort of deeper level, and its impact on the media. So to do so, we asked two questions. How well do people think that political leaders represent their views? And secondly, about whether they feel that the people themselves should have a bigger direct role in decision-making. So it's a simplistic model, and there are many ways of defining populism, and this is not at all perfect, but it does give us a rough idea of people who hold more populist views. So overall, we see that populist views tend to be more concentrated on Southern and Eastern Europe, including countries like Greece, so 71% there, but less focused on Northern Europe and Nordic countries. So Greece, France, and Spain, more than 2/3 are answering yes to both of the questions that I talked about, compared to around half in the US and about 42% in Denmark. So we've looked at the media habits of these groups and found that people who have populist views actually don't get all their news from social media, which is the narrative. They're more likely than non-populists to get their views from television. On the other hand, when they're online, they tend to use Facebook to share and comment more, and they're less trusting of the media. So we've then used all this data together with questions we ask every year about whether people identify as left-wing or right-wing or centrist to map news brands against these different dimensions. So do particular media brands appeal more to people who consider themselves to be left or right on the one hand and more or less populist on the other? So let's take the UK. Not surprisingly, we find the largest bubbles, the largest reach, come from tabloid newspapers like the Mirror on the one hand and the Sun on the other. But we also see that partisan sites like the Canary and Westminster on the right, and then we can add sites that appeal more to non-populists. So that's the BBC in the middle, but also highbrow populations like The Economist and the FT. We can do the same exercise for other countries, and we can see effectively how different groups are represented by the media. So here's the US, a very sort of lopsided picture, and with the vast majority of the media representing people on the left, and then just a few sites on the right, like Fox News and Breitbart, but very little on the populist right. Let's look at Germany, and everything here is sort of more clustered in the center. The media is often accused in Germany of being too close to the government, so the so-called lying press, and then that's left room for quite a number of sites on the populist right, like Junge Freiheit here and the Epoch Times. And then finally, let's look at Spain. So this is one of only a few where the media are representing people with views that could be characterized on the populist left, and that's the brands with the pink bubbles. But generally, there's a more balanced picture between populist left and populist right. So what does all this tell us? I think it raises questions about how well the media is really representing the concerns and diversity of news consumers, and also how far the media should go in that direction in sort of trying to meet those needs. I think it's also a reminder in terms of the size of the bubbles, how people feel about their performance. Are they covering the right agenda? And do they strike the right tone? Where are they perceived to be doing a good job, and where could they do better? So overall, we find relatively high satisfaction about the speed and responsiveness of the news media. So 62% say the media does a good job in keeping me up to date. But only half, 51%, thought that the media did a good job in explaining or helping people understand the news. So it feels like there's a real gap here in terms of expectations, and a real message that people are looking for meaningful content, not just to be bombarded with the latest news. And then 39% feel that the news media is too negative. By the way, I should say that is 59% in Greece for any Greek publishers in the room. 28% say they feel worn out by the amount of news. And finally, 32% say they actively avoid the news these days, sometimes or often. And that's up 6 percentage points since 2017. And when we ask why people are avoiding the news, they say, well, maybe it brings their mood down, or they just feel powerless to change things. Incidentally, the biggest increase in news avoidance of all the countries we look at is in the UK, where the figures are up 7 percentage points on a year ago. Any ideas why? It's not difficult to work out. So 71%, these are some word clouds we produce from people explaining why they're avoiding the news these days. And 71% say they're trying to avoid Brexit news, 31% other political news as well. So these concerns are to some extent about real life events, but also about the agenda and approach of the media itself. And this is really driving a whole load of new media concerns at the moment, including tortoise media, suggesting here we need to wise up and slow down. The correspondent talks about the need to unbreak the news. Republic in Switzerland and Zetland in Denmark are also part of this slow news movement. And elsewhere, you also find attempts to build more constructive or solutions-based journalism. So BBC World Hacks, People Fix the World podcast, and a whole range of explanatory journalism as pioneered by Vox and Aftenposten, and the Indian Express also involved in that. And it's too early really to say, are these initiatives going to work? But they're responding to a real problem that we find in our data this year. And of course, all this journalism, all these new developments need to work on the smartphone. And every year we find in our data that the smartphone becomes more and more important. This chart shows usage for news across countries, and we can see the rate of growth since 2013. So 66% across all countries has increased 4 percentage points in the last year. If we just take Germany as an example, it's gone from somewhere around 10% to 56% this year. And this matters because the smaller screen demands more different formats, more visual, more bite-sized news, but also it's affecting the business model. Display advertising really doesn't work as well. But it's not just the numbers, it's also our dependence on these devices. So in the UK, the smartphone is now the most important device for accessing news first thing in the morning. We asked this question in 2016, 16%. They started their day with the smartphone and found news first on the smartphone. That's increased to 28% since then, and much of that has come from television and come from radio. If you look at the younger groups, the change is even more dramatic. So 54% of people are essentially picking up their smartphone and then finding news probably through social media or maybe a message that comes on the lock screen. And that has increased from 40% in 2016. So real changes in very, very short periods of time. And this in turn is helping to explain the rise of mobile aggregators like Update, but also Apple News, which is another real trend in our data. These services are often increasingly built into the operating systems. So when you buy the phone, it comes with Apple News or it comes with an Android-based aggregator. If you just look at Apple News, we can see 27% of iPhone users in the US say that they use it weekly. And that's actually more reach than the Washington Post on an iPhone. And these services, of course, are really quite hard to ask about because people don't necessarily know that they're consuming Apple News because it simply comes in a tweet, or they don't necessarily know which brand has produced the story, so you just swipe left. This is a comment that's pretty typical about why they like to use it, the convenience, the fact that Apple News separates out the duplication, and then, of course, the problem of attribution. So here's Chloe again talking about it's just the one that comes with my phone. The news just comes up. It's news that comes from my phone rather than necessarily a brand that they can relate to. So finally, what about audio, which has become one of the sort of hottest topics in media today, and in particular, podcasts. So what we see is growth in a number of countries around the percentage of people who say that they are listening to any kind of podcast at least monthly. So it's around a third, 36%. That's up from last year. But interestingly, we've obviously seen an explosion in demand, in supply of news podcasts. So 15% say they now listen to a podcast about news or politics. You can see Politican's one of dozens of European publishers to have launched a daily news podcast in the last year. And the vast majority of the growth is coming from young people. Mark Thompson of the New York Times talked about half of the dailies, 10 million monthly listeners are now under 30. And our data shows that overall, under half, under 35s are about twice as likely to listen as over 35s. When we look at the motivations for podcasts, this is cut by different age groups. So you've got 18 to 24s, 25 to 35s, and then 45 plus. We can see there's quite a big difference between the youngest groups, who are essentially looking at podcasts more as entertainment or as a change from music or just to fill empty time. And then the sort of the middle group, 25 to 34, is really interesting. They are interested in learning something, in progressing. And that's also true of older groups. So very different kinds of podcasts and motivations for what they want to listen to. We also looked at the devices that people use for consuming podcasts. This is just UK data. But you can see, how important the smartphone is. 55%. And it's really, I think, that combination of the smartphone, the better headphones, the easier distribution, so there's no longer just Apple, it's also Google, Spotify. This is really what is fueling the growth in podcasts. And again, just a couple of quotes, which I think sum up why people, these are young people quotes, but why people find podcasts so useful. They're great for multitasking. They're incredibly convenient. They're really easy to use. You don't have to navigate your way around it. As this person says, you're just sort of letting it wash over you. And then particularly for younger people, this is about control. It's the fact that, yes, it plays when it plays, but the finding of it, the scheduling of it, curating of it is under their control when they listen. And that's obviously particularly relevant for that generation. And then finally, the whole question of the content itself, that it's much more diverse. The tone is different. This is not just radio. This is a much more diverse range of things they can listen to, often produced by people like them. So podcasts are being driven by the smartphone, but what about smart speakers? Well, overall, we are seeing, and there was a session on this earlier at Chen, we're seeing really significant growth. The trajectory remains extremely strong. And this graph just shows two of the countries we've been following to 2017, where these devices have been in market for long enough. And this is the growth story. So it's pretty much doubled in the UK from 7% to 14% in the last year. And we see that all over Europe as there are now more international launches. But how's adoption going elsewhere? So this is, we now have data from about a dozen countries, and the take-up is pretty impressive. So we have Australia, Austria, and Canada, where they've been around for 12 months, 18 months. But what's interesting is the darker bar, the percentage of people who say these use these for news. So if anything, usage for news in the last week is falling as a proportion as mainstream audiences come on board. And I think both publishers and platforms haven't really worked out yet what the use cases are or produced compelling enough content for the smart speaker. Overall, only around a third of smart speaker users say they use these devices for news, which confirms our report that we did last year, which suggested people were mainly using them for listening to music or for turning on live radio or for setting alarms. So those are really some of the main findings of the 2019 report, and here are just a few final questions that emerge. So can we as an industry build on the greater reliance on reputable brands? Can we turn that into financial gain or greater loyalty, and how do we do that? Secondly, how should publishers respond to those findings about negativity, about the fact that people say they're worn out by the amount of news? They find it depressing. In terms of the pay, who will be the winners, who will be the losers? Do we need to rethink pricing? Do we need to bundle content or create different content to bring into our bundles or bundle stuff together to make it work for people who want frictionless access to multiple brands, which is a sort of core consumer demand. In terms of WhatsApp and messaging, how do we respond to it? How do we distribute content? How do we use these networks for listening when they are less transparent and the user's much more in control? And then finally, what do we think about audio? Do we buy this, the move to podcasts? Is there going to be any money in it? Is it overhyped? These are questions that we can, I think, at least take a few questions now in the Q&A. But thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much. Guys, you've worked hard. Do you want to take a seat? And we will take some questions. There should be some microphones there. There should be some microphones ready, roaming around. So many questions in there. One of the things I thought was really interesting is that really followed on from what Amy Webb was saying yesterday about smart peripherals and about how those are growing and how we're going to see more and more. So many different trends. Do we have any questions from the audience? We have got a burning one right down here, and if we could get another microphone just down here for afterwards, that would be great. If you could introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Phil Chetwynd. I'm the Global News Director of AFP. Nick, I just want to come back to the point about voice and podcasts, mainly because we were having quite an anguished discussion last night about, what do we do, mainly over the issue of monetization. We can all see the trend, we can all see the interest in it, but we're all thinking, this is big resources to put towards it. We all hear the credits at the Daily at the end where there's a team of 20 to 30 people doing it, and we all hear they're pleased to subscribe to the New York Times afterwards. So I just wondered if you had any sort of thoughts on that, or whether you had any sort of emerging data on that.
Yeah, obviously we're looking at the consumer side, but I think you have to look at, we shouldn't compare ourselves with the New York Times, right? But they've made a $10 million business out of the Daily, and they're sort of thinking about how they franchise it, how they take it back to television. What does it mean for the rest of us, right? So I think I think that the monetization models are still emerging, and obviously they're most mature in the US, where we've seen sort of doubling of advertising going into podcasts, but yet it's still a fraction of the advertising revenue. But I think we shouldn't necessarily just look at making money today. We should think about how this fits into the wider portfolio. So if you look at many publishers like The Guardian, The Economist, they're using it essentially as a way of building loyalty for sampling, so that they then say during or at the end of it, would you like now to subscribe, or they offer a special offer, so there's some of that going on. But I think in the longer term, and then there's paid content opportunities. So for certain blockbusters, really distinctive content, then people like Spotify are starting to pay money. But all of that that's more current affairs than news anyway, and all that requires really significant resources. So I think the way to think about it, particularly if you're a subscription publisher, is how do you build loyalty? How do you, over time, and podcasts are amazing. You're spending time with hosts. You're getting to know the brand in a much more real way. And if you combine that and package that with the subscription option, which companies like Politico are doing, I think that may be powerful. And I increasingly think people are not spending very much time with digital, and to build sustainable businesses, you need to have something that more of a direct relationship. Podcast is one way of doing it, events is another way of doing it. So I think there's some of this is still emerging, but I think we shouldn't just think about where's the money today, we need to think about the long-term trend.
Thank you. There was another question here. Have we got a microphone?
Yes, Samh Abdallah of Al-Ahram, Egypt. Thanks for the report, great one. But I'm just wondering if you have certain explanations for some of the results you have mentioned earlier. Like, for example, why should people in certain countries like Norway or the United States pay for content while people in other countries doesn't pay? Or why should people subscribe for the Washington Post or the New York Times, with all the respect, of course, but at the very end they are providing us with news that are one way or another available somewhere else. So perhaps there is a secret with the content or something that they are offering, others does not, rather than news. I'm not sure. But this is a very important issue, because websites will never be able to survive unless they gain money, and till this very moment, we don't know how to make it. Thirdly, I think we need to have a report or a study on the behavior of the subscribers, because sometimes they subscribe and then they unsubscribe at certain time. Sometimes they subscribe for a certain place and then they move to another later on. What their expectations, what they are looking for, perhaps that would be useful to have some other time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. I mean, I suppose I'm a typical academic in the sense that I'm completely obsessed with money. I think the question you ask is one of the defining ones for our industry, is how do we make the business work? I think you also point out something that we need to keep in mind as we think about subscription revenues and other forms of reader revenues, which is that a lot of news is not worth paying for, because there are perfectly acceptable substitutes available for free. And also that even to this day, with the rise of subscription in high-income markets at least, the majority of news providers still provide online news for free at the point of consumption. We looked at this in Europe, and while the majority of newspapers now operate some form of pay model, though much of it allows for some free access, every broadcaster we looked at, free at the point of consumption, almost every digital-born provider, free at the point of consumption. So most news is still free online and will be for the foreseeable future. What makes some titles or some countries stand out? I respect the success of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Economist and the FT in this space, but I think it's much more useful to look at titles that don't have an addressable market of sort of 2 billion globally. So I suppose that I would say this coming from the Nordic countries myself, from Denmark, that I think it's probably more interesting in some ways to look at what sets aside the Scandinavian or Nordic publishers that are succeeding in this space. And I think there are sort of two things. One is that they have tried. I think we need to remember we have for a long time not tried to ask people to pay for our journalism. Right? I mean, 20 years of learned behavior of free at the point of consumption news is hard to change, and it's not going to change overnight. This is a long, hard slog. It's not going to work for everybody, but even for the ones for whom it'll work, it'll take years to build up a culture where this is a credible proposition and where people will actually subscribe. So one is trying and being clear-eyed about what you're trying to achieve and keeping on that path unless you have irrefutable evidence it's not going to work. So try to stick with it. And the other one is, I would say that a lot of the Nordic publishers, I think, have been very clear-eyed about really looking at, as you say yourself, what are the behaviors of the people who are willing to subscribe? What is the journalism that we do that they really value, that they really appreciate? And it's different for different titles. The local papers in the A Media group in Norway find that it's community, it's service journalism, it's distinct events material for a very specific community that's unique to that title, so that works for their local titles in Norway. A national upmarket title like Dagens Nyheter in Sweden find that it's long-form features, it's investigative journalism, it's scoops. So it's different things for different titles, but what all of these titles have in common is that they've looked very closely at what is it actually that we do that is distinct, that is valuable, and that people show their appreciation of, and that on that basis we can ask them to pay for.
Just going to add very briefly, I think it's not just the content, it's also the experience, and by that I mean the whole experience. So it's when you go to websites, but also how that applies to the offline things. You've got to build a relationship and an affinity, and I think that's what the news industry and digital has done quite badly, and it's about how, I think the next 5 years, about how we learn to do that better.
Super, thank you. I'm going to add one more thing, if I may. There's a Polish chap called Gregor Piechota, who has done a lot of research into subscriptions in a very detailed manner, but I would suggest looking him up because he writes a lot very specifically about that. We have time for one more question. If we could get, I think that's Natalia putting her hand up.
Hi, is it working? Hi, Natalia Antelava. I was struck there wasn't very much on newsletters, and I wonder if there's anything you have to say on that.
Yeah. So in the report we have, we're looking at newsletters over time. It's interesting that people in different countries have different, are using newsletters more or less. So in the US, they're extremely important. We found in our data this year that for subscribers, they're an incredibly important way of building that habit and providing the right kind of summary at the beginning of the day or the end of the day or at the weekend. But use much less, for example, in Nordic countries, which have been very successful with subscriptions. So some interesting, but actually the overall percentage of people using newsletters tends to be older, tends to be around, average of around 10% in most countries. So again, it's the very loyal, interested in news people who are using newsletters. By contrast, the mobile notifications have grown much, much faster, and I think because of the importance of the smartphone are going to be increasingly important going forwards and are much more popular with younger people. So again, it partly depends who your audience is, who you're trying to reach, whether you're a subscription business or not, as to whether newsletters are going to be part of what you do. But in terms of habit building, both newsletters and notifications, I think, are going to be increasingly important going forward.
Super, thank you so much. We are going to wrap up this session. However, Rasmus and Nick are going to be upstairs in the workshop room, I believe at 10:15, to have more discussion and answer more questions. So if you do have more questions, please do join them at 10:15 upstairs in the workshop area. Rasmus, Nick, as always, so much. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.